Today we will explore a fascinating and often forgotten period of maritime history, the era of medieval pirates who dominated the waters of northern Europe long before Blackbeard or Captain Kidd sailed the Caribbean seas. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. The icy waves of the English Channel break against the bow of a merchant ship loaded with English wool. The year is 1311, and Captain Bartholomew de Well watches the horizon with experienced eyes. He has known these seas for decades, sailed these routes countless times, but has never grown accustomed to the feeling of vulnerability that accompanies every crossing. Somewhere beyond that morning mist, hidden in the inlets of the Breton coast, or waiting in seemingly peaceful ports, are the men who turned piracy into a way of life, as common as fishing or the spice trade. De Well's ship seeks shelter from an approaching storm. He finds anchorage at the Palace of Rythe, a place he knows well, where other merchant vessels frequently take refuge from bad weather. The darkness of night falls over the waters, and de Well finally allows his tired eyes to rest. He does not know it, but this will be one of the last nights of peace he will know for a long time. During the early hours, a vessel approaches silently. The men on board are not merchants looking for shelter. They are predators who have found their prey. John Lefau. Clark commands the attack with the precision of someone who has performed this operation dozens of times. His men board de Well's ship, overpower the crew before they can react, and proceed to loot the entire cargo. Not satisfied with the robbery, they destroy the ship itself, likely to prevent de Well from alerting the authorities before the pirates are far beyond any pursuit. This is just one among thousands of similar episodes that occurred in these waters over centuries. But who were these men who turned the sea into their hunting territory? The answer reveals a surprising truth about medieval society. The pirates of northern Europe were not marginalized outlaws living on the fringes of civilization. Many were respected merchants, influential nobles, and even royal officials who divided their activities between legitimate trade and plunder on the seas. Leclerc, for example, was wealthy and well-connected enough to manipulate the English judicial system when de Well finally managed to track him down and sue him. The local sheriff detained Leclerc and seized his ship as the law required. But from that moment on, the process began to drag on suspiciously. The sheriff constantly postponed the hearings, was never available on the dates de Well proposed for the trial, and finally scheduled the final session for a date when de Well could not attend. The case was closed without any punishment for the pirate. It would take de Well 4 long years, and he would need to appeal directly to the king to receive any compensation for his losses. This was the pattern, not the exception. To understand how piracy became so endemic in the waters of northern Europe during the Middle Ages, we must first understand the conditions that made it possible, and even profitable. The medieval sea was a radically different environment from the one we know today. Navigation was primitive, depending almost entirely on the site of the coast for orientation. Captains avoided deep-sea voyages whenever possible, preferring to sail along the coastline where they could orient themselves by known landmarks. This meant that maritime routes were extremely predictable, and any pirate with local knowledge knew exactly where to find his victims. The ships of the time, mainly cogs and hulks, were robust vessels designed to carry large amounts of cargo. They generally possessed a single sail and were remarkably difficult to maneuver. Some had oars to assist in calm waters or in situations requiring greater control, but this came at the cost of reducing the space available for cargo. There was no significant difference between merchant ships and warships. Any commercial vessel could be converted into a combat ship simply by replacing the cargo with bunks for armed men. Cannons had not yet been developed for effective naval use, which meant that any confrontation at sea inevitably resulted in boarding and hand-to-hand combat. These technological limitations completely shaped the nature of medieval piracy. Pirates first needed to find their targets, a difficult task on the high seas where ships could easily pass each other without ever being sighted. The solution was to patrol the busiest maritime routes, the known passage points, estuaries and anchorages where ships usually made stops. Some pirates simply waited outside ports, watching the coming and going of vessels until they identified a promising target. Others were even more audacious, attacking ships anchored in the ports themselves, looting the cargo and fleeing before local authorities could organize a response. Intercepting a ship on the open sea was significantly more difficult. Even when a pirate spotted a potential prey, the pursuit could last hours or even days, depending on wind conditions and the skill of the respective captains. More frequently, pirates began their pursuits while still in coastal waters, following their targets into the high seas only when they already had a positional advantage. Piracy was, above all, a game of patience, local knowledge, and calculated opportunism. Not all acts of piracy were exactly what they seemed. There were also internal scams, situations in which a merchant ship's own crew stole the cargo and divided the profits among themselves. To cover up the crime, the sailors claimed that pirates had attacked the ship and taken everything, far from the eyes of reliable witnesses. In the vast and merciless ocean, it was almost impossible to distinguish truth from fiction. The merchants who hired these ships often had no way of verifying what had actually happened to their goods. When pirates finally boarded their prey, they always sought victory through overwhelming force. They preferred to attack vessels with smaller crews than their own, and frequently several pirate ships cooperated to intercept and board a single merchant ship. Before the attack, pirates usually hailed their victim and tried to persuade the crew to hand over the cargo without resistance. Most sailors offered at least symbolic resistance, not out of bravery, but to avoid later accusations of complicity with the attackers. After the capture, pirates generally stripped the ship of everything of value, including anchors, ropes, and nautical equipment that could be sold or used on their own ships. The crew of the captured ship was often left unharmed, except for those who had been killed during the initial resistance. Sometimes the pirates also confiscated the ship itself, leaving the crew on land or releasing them in some foreign port. Wealthy passengers could be held hostage for ransom, a lucrative practice that would be perfected by future generations of privateers. The popular image of pirates indiscriminately massacring their victims was, in reality, a rare occurrence in medieval piracy. Extreme violence usually only happened when there was some previous personal dispute between the pirate and the merchant, or when their countries were at war. Pragmatism prevailed over cruelty. Dead sailors could not sail the captured ship, and a reputation for extreme violence could lead to more desperate resistance in future encounters. Most pirates preferred their victims to surrender peacefully, making the looting faster and less risky for everyone involved. What may seem surprising to us today is that medieval pirates rarely feared being identified by their victims. This apparently unconcerned attitude derived from a legal reality that was frustrating for those seeking justice. No clear and universal laws against piracy existed. Crimes committed at sea fell into a murky legal zone where the jurisdiction of any specific king was questionable. The seas were considered territory beyond national borders, a space where normal laws did not fully apply. There were, it is true, some maritime codes that tried to regulate relations between captains, crews, and merchants. The rolls of Oleron, originating from the French island of the same name, established customs and accepted practices in maritime trade. The law merchant governed commercial transactions, contracts, and claims for compensation. But these laws focused mainly on financial reparation, not on criminal punishment. The death penalty for pirates was extremely rare, even in cases of murder, unless some king had a personal interest in the outcome of the case. The first pirate to be executed in England was William de Brigahow in 1228, and even this execution was exceptional enough to be recorded in historical annals. For most pirates, the worst possible scenario was being forced to pay compensation to their victims, a prospect that hardly deterred them when the profits of piracy consistently outweighed the risks. Complexity increased dramatically when pirates and victims were of different nationalities. If an English merchant were robbed by a French pirate, to which king should he appeal for justice? The pirate was under the jurisdiction of the King of France, who had no legal obligation to prosecute crimes against the subjects of another monarch. Pursuing a foreign pirate could create serious diplomatic incidents, potentially escalating into conflicts between entire kingdoms. Given these complications, financial compensation negotiated between the involved governments often made more practical sense than any attempt at criminal justice. There was also the question of who exactly the pirates were. To engage in piracy, a man first needed to own a ship, or at least have access to one. Ships were enormously expensive investments, accessible only to the wealthiest members of society. Medieval pirates were not impoverished outcasts seeking to survive. They were prosperous merchants, ambitious nobles, and maritime entrepreneurs who saw piracy as a natural extension of their legitimate commercial activities. Almost all pirates were also merchants. They alternated between honest trade and plunder as opportunities presented themselves. A cargo of wool sold in one port, a rival ship looted on the way back home. Many were respected figures in their coastal communities, with powerful friends and considerable influence. Exactly the kind of people capable of bribing officials, manipulating judicial processes, and obtaining royal pardons in exchange for favors. At the lower end of this social scale were the fishermen and coastal sailors who practiced opportunistic piracy. Using small boats, they operated closer to the shore, attacking vessels in distress or taking advantage of ships that ran aground on the treacherous rocks of the coastline. Although they were less capable of escaping justice than their wealthier colleagues, they were also harder to identify and track. Their smaller operations left few documentary traces. A classic example of this opportunistic coastal piracy was the pirates of the Breton Raz de Seine, a dangerous stretch of water at the tip of the Brittany coast. The region was notorious for its reefs and treacherous currents, where inexperienced sailors frequently ran aground or suffered damage that forced them to abandon their vessels. Local fishermen developed a fearsome reputation for taking advantage of these situations. When a ship was in danger, they would board their skiffs, approach the vessel in distress, and loot it completely. They were more wreckers than pirates in the traditional sense, but the result for their victims was equally devastating. Among the most notorious pirates of the medieval era, we find the Allard family, merchants and privateers who operated out of Winchelsea, one of the famous English Cinque Ports. To understand the importance of this confederation of ports, we must go back in time and examine the peculiar relationship between the English crown and these maritime communities. The Cinque Ports, originally 5 ports in the English southeast, formed a confederation dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period, possibly to the reign of Edward the Confessor. Hastings, Romney, Hythe, Dover, and Sandwich were the original members, later expanded to include Winchelsea and Rye as ancient towns with similar privileges. By the end of the Middle Ages, more than 40 locations were associated with the confederation. The English Crown did not maintain a permanent navy during most of the Middle Ages. When it needed naval force to defend the coast or conduct military operations abroad, the king turned to the Cinque Ports. In exchange for providing ships and sailors equipped for royal service, the ports received extraordinary privileges: tax exemption, the right to judge their own civil and criminal cases, authority to collect shipwrecks and flotsam, and freedom to trade among themselves without restrictions. This autonomy created an environment where the line between authorized privateering and pure piracy became conveniently blurred. The men of the Cinque Ports were often referred to as the King's Pirates, and His Majesty regularly claimed a fifth of any booty they captured. Piracy was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged when it served the interests of the crown. The sailors of the Cinque Ports earned a fierce reputation over the centuries. A medieval chronicler, writing from the safe comfort of his monastery, noted with pride that these men, trained in the rigorous school of piracy, could be trusted to fight to the death and massacre French crews faster than it takes to eat a biscuit. They were slow to observe truces and treated safe conducts with open contempt. Nothing perhaps was more brutal than the attack by the pirates of Winchelsea on the Jews when they were expelled from England in 1290. Many were attacked and robbed in the middle of the English Channel, murdered and thrown overboard. An entire group, including some of London's wealthiest Jews, was left on a sandbank that was subsequently submerged by the tide. In this specific case, those responsible were executed on the gallows, but this must be considered the exception that proves the rule. The punishment likely occurred because the crime involved people of considerable wealth and importance, generating enough pressure for justice to be served. The Allard family thrived magnificently in this environment. They were successful merchants who accumulated wealth both through legitimate trade and blatant piracy. In 1322, a commission of Oyer and Terminer was formed to investigate allegations made by German merchants against several members of the Allard family and their associate, Robert Bataille. The Germans claimed they had been victims of piracy in the port of Harwich. The commission, however, was frustrated before it even began its work. The Allards were one step ahead. They had used their influence to obtain royal pardons just days before the commission was convened. To add to the irony, only a few weeks later, Robert Bataille was appointed an admiral in the king's service. Being a pirate was not a hindrance to prestigious positions, it was practically a prerequisite. In December 1323, they were active again. Another commission was established, this time to investigate allegations that they had looted the cargo of a Flemish merchant in the port of Sandwich. Since England was at peace with Flanders at that time, this was not simply piracy, it was a diplomatic incident that could provoke retaliation and damage important commercial relations. Justice at last? Not remotely. A few months later, Stephen Allard was appointed an admiral in the king's service. The message was clear. For men sufficiently wealthy, powerful, and useful to the crown, piracy carried no significant consequences. The reason why men like Stephen Allard could attack Flemish merchants with impunity lay partially in another peculiarity of medieval maritime law, the concept of reprisal. When someone failed to prosecute a pirate in the courts or obtain compensation for their losses through legal means, it was considered perfectly acceptable to seek reprisal. This term had a very specific legal meaning among sailors. It meant that the victim could take the law into their own hands to recover the lost value, and only that value. Stephen Matsib Allard himself had been a victim of Flemish pirates in 1317. The legal processes likely dragged on without result, so Stephen may have decided to settle the matter on his own. Now the Flemish merchant he attacked in 1322 and the Flemish pirates of 1317 were likely not the same people. However, it was considered acceptable to seek reprisal against foreigners of the same nationality, even if the specific individuals targeted were completely innocent. Naturally, this peculiar custom could easily lead to escalating acts of retaliatory piracy. And this became especially intense in times of war. Northern European powers generally did not maintain permanent military naval forces. Thus, in times of conflict, merchant ships and their captains were recruited and equipped for war. France and England engaged in significant naval conflicts throughout the Middle Ages, both with each other and with other neighboring powers. Neither maintained anything that could be called a permanent navy. Their fleets consisted, therefore, of a considerable number of merchants converted into privateers, each eager to profit from any conflict. It is not hard to imagine that naval warfare in medieval waters frequently degenerated into reciprocal and increasing acts of piracy. The distinctions between official war and personal piracy became impossible to draw. Captains commissioned to attack enemy ships frequently expanded their activities to include neutral or even allied ships, as long as they could escape the consequences. A particularly illustrative example occurred in 1315–16 when France entered a dispute with the Flemish and sought to impose a trade embargo against them. The French Admiral Berenger Blanc was tasked with patrolling the waters south of the English coast to enforce this embargo. However, Blanc and his fleet soon began attacking neutral vessels and even Allied ships in blatant acts of piracy. His fleet went as far as attacking English ships, even though France was not at war with England. This led to a long and protracted series of negotiations before the French and English monarchies finally agreed on appropriate compensation. Later in the 14th century, the 100 Years' War broke out between France and England. To control the English Channel, both sides turned to the large-scale recruitment of privateers. They became so dependent on these hired pirates that they could not afford to act against them, even when they preyed on neutral or allied targets. A pirate in those times knew he was indispensable and could expect free pardons whenever a truce was signed. This was truly the golden age of piracy in northern European waters. Before we explore some of the most notorious pirates of this period, it is worth stepping even further back in time to meet a figure who became legendary in his own day, Eustace the Monk. Born around 1170 near Boulogne in northern France, Eustace Busquet was the son of a minor noble. As was common for younger sons of the nobility, he was sent to a Benedictine monastery where he was presumably supposed to spend the rest of his days in prayer and contemplation. Monastic life, however, did not suit Eustace's temperament. Accounts from the time indicate that he was given to mischief, encouraging other monks to eat when they should have been fasting, to swear when they should have been reciting the divine office, and to behave in ways that scandalized his superiors. A 13th-century fictionalized biography, written by an anonymous Picard poet, claims that Eustace traveled to Toledo to study black magic, becoming so proficient in the dark arts that no one in France could rival his skills. Later generations would be convinced of this claim, attributing Eustace's extraordinary feats to the supernatural powers he supposedly acquired. When his father was murdered, Eustace abandoned the monastic habit in search of revenge. This quest eventually led him to the service of Count Renaud of Damartin, for whom he worked as a seneschal, an administrative position of considerable responsibility. But the relationship soured when Eustace was accused of misappropriating funds. His lands and titles were confiscated, and he became an outlaw. Eustace's revenge was creative and persistent. He burned down 2 of the Count's mills, stole horses, ambushed guards who pursued him, and lived in the forests of Boulogne and Hardelot as a bandit, always escaping through ingenious disguises. The stories of his adventures as an outlaw became part of the region's folklore, later influencing the legends of Robin Hood. Eventually, Eustace turned to the sea. With his brothers, he became a pirate in the English Channel, where his fame grew exponentially. King John of England employed him intermittently from 1205 to 1212, commanding a fleet of 30 ships against French interests. Eustace and his men established bases in the Channel Islands, including Sark and Guernsey, from which they launched devastating attacks against the Normandy coast. During this period, Eustace gained an almost supernatural reputation. It was said he could make himself invisible to surprise his enemies, a claim likely based on his ability to appear unexpectedly using the Channel Islands as hidden bases. When he attacked some English coastal villages, King John briefly declared him an outlaw, but soon issued a pardon because he needed Eustace's services. In 1212, however, loyalties shifted again. Renaud of Damartin, Eustace's old enemy, allied with King John and apparently poisoned the king's mind against the pirate. Eustace changed sides, offering his services to King Philip II of France, and was soon attacking Folkestone and other English ports with the same vigor he had previously directed against the French. When civil war broke out in England in 1215, Eustace supported the rebel barons who had forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. The barons offered the English crown to Prince Louis of France, and Eustace was instrumental in transporting the prince across the Channel in 1216. For a time, it seemed a Frenchman might sit on the English throne, with Eustace as his trusted admiral. Fate, however, had other plans. King John died in 1216, and his minor son, Henry III, was quickly crowned. Under the regency of capable men, forces loyal to the crown began to turn the tide. In August 1217, Eustace was commanding a fleet carrying crucial reinforcements for Prince Louis when he was intercepted by an English squadron under the command of Hubert de Burgh, sailing from Dover. The battle that followed was brutal. Eustace caused considerable havoc among his former allies, but the English employed a devastating tactic. They threw powdered lime into the faces of the French, temporarily blinding them. English troops boarded Eustace's ships and defeated his men in hand-to-hand combat. Eustace himself managed to escape with his flagship, but on August 24th, he was surrounded by a Cinque Ports fleet commanded by Philip d'Aubigny at the Battle of Sandwich. When the ship was captured, the English conducted a thorough search for Eustace. He was finally found hiding in the hold among the bilge water. The pirate offered an enormous sum for his life, 10,000 marks according to some sources, and promised to serve the King of England faithfully from then on. But his words fell on deaf ears. Eustace had become so hated by the English crews that no ransom was acceptable. He was offered only one choice, to be beheaded over the ship's gunwale or over the side of the trebuchet that was being carried as cargo on the deck. The head of Eustace the monk was displayed in London as a trophy. Eustace's defeat effectively ended any hope of resistance for Prince Louis. In September 1217, he signed the Treaty of Lambeth, renouncing his claims to the English throne and returning to France, where he would eventually reign as Louis VIII. Eustace's brothers continued operating in the Channel for some time, but without their charismatic leader, their activities gradually diminished. Eustace's story perfectly illustrates the fluidity of loyalties and the opportunistic nature of medieval piracy. He served multiple lords, changed sides as it suited his interests, and was alternatively hero and villain depending on which flag he was flying at any given moment. His career demonstrates that piracy was not simply crime, it was a tool of war, diplomacy, and personal power. Fast-forwarding a few centuries, we find another conflict that illustrates how piracy was intertwined with international politics: the Anglo-Hanseatic War of the late 15th century. The Hanseatic League was a confederation of German merchant cities that dominated trade in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. Its main cities included Lübeck, Hamburg, and Danzig, and the League maintained privileged trading posts throughout Europe, including the famous Steel Yard in London. For decades, tensions grew between English merchants and the Hanseatics. The English resented the special privileges the League enjoyed in England and coveted access to the lucrative Baltic markets. The Hanseatics, in turn, fiercely resisted any attempt to limit their commercial advantages. At the center of this conflict emerged a figure who deserves special attention: Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known in English history as the Kingmaker for his crucial role in the Wars of the Roses. But to Hanseatic and French merchants, Warwick was first and foremost a pirate. In 1458, Warwick was captain of Calais, responsible for maintaining control of the English Channel for the English crown. His fleet, however, chose to attack the Hanseatic salt fleet, capturing 18 ships from Lübeck. This was problematic because the Hanseatic League and England were not at war. Warwick claimed he had acted only to raise essential funds to maintain his fleet. Some suspected he had done it to create trouble for the Lancastrian court. There was likely truth in both claims, but there was also almost certainly a third reason. For a long time, there had been significant commercial rivalry and even active hostility between the Hanseatics and many English merchants. Warwick's fleet consisted of many ships belonging to these same merchants, people whose support he might well need in any future dispute with the court. Warwick's act of piracy may have been designed, at least in part, to strengthen his support among these powerful mercantile interests. Warwick's actions can be partially understood within a history of escalating acts of retaliatory piracy involving Hanseatics and English mercantile interests. However, for Warwick, the issue became personal. He would become a vocal opponent of the Hanseatics. His actions in 1458 had provoked a confrontation with the Lancastrian court. But he was consistent in his hostility. His actions in the late 1460s would go further, leading Yorkist England into open war with the League. In June 1468, English ships in the Danish port of Helsingør were surrounded and boarded by German marines. They were seized, and their cargo confiscated and sold. According to the Danes, this was done to compensate for the acts of English pirates. However, the men who boarded the English ships were not Danes, but Germans from the Hanseatic port of Danzig. Among the seized ships was at least one belonging to Warwick himself. Warwick used this as a pretext to drag a reluctant Edward IV into an all-out war with the League. It would be a naval war, and as such, a war fought primarily by privateers, and it would bring to prominence perhaps the most successful pirate of the era, Paul Beneke. Beneke was a city councillor from Danzig and a distinguished naval commander even before the war began. He had won glory in the naval battle of Bornholm against the Danes in 1455 and executed an audacious attack on Anholt in 1466. But it was during the war against Yorkist England that Beneke became the terror of the seas. When Beneke was commissioned by Lübeck, the leading city of the Hanseatic League, to captain the ship Peter von Danzig, he chose to become a co-owner instead of receiving a salary. It was a calculated gamble that demonstrated his confidence in his own abilities. The Peter von Danzig was one of the largest and most formidable warships of its time, 51 meters long with a displacement of 1,600 tons. For context, the Santa Maria that took Columbus to the Americas measured only 19 meters and displaced 108 tons. Beneke captured his first English ship on New Year's Day, 1470. Later in 1471, he captured the mayor of Dover, tricking him into coming on board by pretending to be French. He burned up to 18 merchant ships anchored on the English coast in a single action. He even managed to capture the Lord Mayor of London while the unfortunate official was returning from France. But Beneke's most spectacular coup was yet to come. In April 1473, sailing through the waters off Zeeland, not far from Sluis, the Peter von Danzig spotted a galley leaving Bruges. The vessel was ostensibly owned by Tommaso Portinari, manager of the Medici Bank branch in Bruges, and was sailing under the neutral flag of Burgundy. Beneke approached and demanded to know if there were English goods on board. The captain of the galley laughed loudly and pointed to the large Burgundian flag. Beneke was unimpressed. He and his men boarded the galley and looted it completely. The cargo was extraordinary. Wool fabrics, linens, tapestries, furs, and among the most valuable items, a triptych painted by Hans Memling representing the Last Judgment. The painting had been commissioned for the chapel of Angelo Tani, a manager of the Medici Bank, and included a portrait of Portinari himself. The total value of the captured goods represented one of the largest pirate hauls of the century. Naturally, the owners protested vigorously. The matter was taken to the papal court, with the Medici mobilizing all their influence to demand the return of the painting. But the Danzig City Council refused, claiming the capture was a legitimate act of war, since the Hanseatic League was in conflict with England. The painting was never returned. Instead, it was donated by 3 Danzig patricians to the Church of the Brotherhood of St. George, from where it eventually passed to the city's St. Mary's Church, where it remains to this day. Beneke's spectacular act of piracy proved to be one of the last great actions of the war. Both sides were ready for peace. The threat represented by Beneke encouraged Edward IV to be more inclined to negotiate. At that moment, Edward was more secure on his throne and consequently less dependent on the support of the militant mercantile faction. Equally important, the belligerent Warwick, a major barrier to peace, was no longer present. Many Hanseatics, in turn, were increasingly nervous about the antics of independent privateers like Beneke. Beneke's haul may have been impressive, but it included goods belonging to people like the powerful Medici family, whom the League did not want to displease. The resulting Treaty of Utrecht saw Edward IV agree to virtually all the League's demands. Hanseatic privileges were restored, and the Steelyard resumed its powerful position within the London merchant community. In contrast, English merchants received no significant concessions in terms of better access to Eastern European markets. While Edward had proven it was possible to achieve tactical victories over Hanseatic privateers, the fact was that Beneke and others were still at large. English merchant shipping was, if anything, at greater risk in 1473-74 than when the conflict had begun. However, in the end, it was the Hanseatic economic boycott, more than its naval actions, that forced Edward to capitulate. And after 1471, The removal of Warwick from the scene made it much easier to reach an agreement. The Anglo-Hanseatic War ended in victory for the League, but it also demonstrated the limitations of piracy as an instrument of state policy. Pirates like Benica were powerful tools, but they were also unpredictable and difficult to control. Their actions could create as many problems as they solved, alienating potential allies and complicating diplomatic negotiations. In the 19th century, Benica became a national hero, not to the Poles who now inhabited Danzig, but to the Germans living in the city. The Nazis built a memorial shrine for Benica, complete with a statue and mural. The writer Günter Grass included an extensive passage about him in his novel The Tin Drum. One man's pirate is another man's naval hero. While we explore these individual stories of notorious pirates, we must not lose sight of the broader context. Piracy was not an aberration of the medieval system, it was an intrinsic feature of it. The seas of northern Europe were a space where the normal rules of society did not fully apply, where ambitious men could build fortunes and reputations that would be impossible on land. The feudal structure of medieval society, with its emphasis on personal loyalties and reciprocal obligations, extended to the sea in peculiar ways. A successful pirate could become a valuable ally for a king in need of naval force. A prosperous merchant could use piracy to eliminate competitors and expand his market share. An ambitious noble could use plunder to finance his political intrigues. All these possibilities coexisted, often in the same person. The lack of a clear distinction between peaceful trade and piracy was fundamental to this system. A ship carrying goods to sell in one port could attack a competitor on the way and arrive at its destination with both its original cargo and its victims' spoils. War and trade blended in ways that make our modern categories inadequate to describe medieval reality. Scholars who have tried to define precisely what constituted piracy in the Middle Ages have found themselves repeatedly frustrated. Historian Susan Rose observed that the first problem for any researcher studying medieval piracy is that the contemporary definition of the term was vague and imprecise. Piracy occupied a grey area between robbery, semi-official activity, and low-intensity trade war. It was difficult to distinguish where crime ended and where reprisals and private war began. Naval historian N.A.M. Roger argued that it was impossible to distinguish hostile trade from peaceful trade in the Middle Ages. He stated that peaceful trade was almost non-existent, not only due to the fact that the sea was considered an area beyond laws and treaties. In this environment, peace or war between kingdoms meant little, and a ship at sea always had to be vigilant, as piracy abounded. Although medieval jurists agreed that technically something called piracy existed, that is, criminal violent plunder at sea, in practice, a consensual definition was absent. The English Crown's reaction to this use of violence was ambiguous. On one hand, piracy was an integral part of maritime trade, and it served the purpose of training sailors for naval warfare. On the other hand, excessive acts of piracy could damage diplomatic relations and provoke retaliations that affected all the merchants of the kingdom. This ambiguity persisted throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. The men who would later crew Francis Drake's fleet against the Spanish Armada in 1588 were, in many respects, simply the latest representatives of a long tradition of English privateers. Piracy evolved, adapted to new technologies and new political contexts, but its medieval roots remained clearly visible. As the Middle Ages came to an end, the seas of northern Europe remained a reliable hunting ground for pirates. Enterprising privateers would not only survive the transition to the modern era, but thrive in it. The same qualities that made a successful pirate in the 14th century, maritime knowledge, audacity, political connections, and a willingness to operate on the margins of the law, would continue to be valuable in the following centuries. The truth was that the merchant pirates of the northern seas were often too politically influential, not to mention too useful, to ever be properly brought to justice. They thrived by operating within legal grey areas, and even when brought to court, many were wealthy enough to buy their way out of trouble. The stories we explored in this documentary represent only a fraction of the countless acts of piracy that occurred in these waters over the centuries. For every John Leclerc whose case was documented in legal records, there were dozens of anonymous pirates whose activities were never recorded. For every Allard family whose influence preserved evidence of their exploits, there were entire communities of coastal fishermen whose opportunistic piracy left few historical traces. What these stories teach us goes beyond mere historical curiosity. They reveal a society where violence was an acceptable tool of commercial competition, where the law was flexible enough to accommodate the interests of the powerful, and where the line between criminality and heroism depended entirely on perspective. The medieval pirates of Northern Europe were not romantic figures operating outside the power structures of their time. They were active participants in those structures, using them and being used by them. The next time we think of pirates, perhaps it is worth remembering that long before Blackbeard terrorized the Caribbean, long before the black flag with skull and crossbones became the universal symbol of piracy, men like Eustace the Monk, the Allards of Winchelsea and Paul Beneke of Danzig had already established the traditions that their more famous successors would merely continue. The medieval seas of Northern Europe were the cradle of a maritime culture where piracy was not the anomaly, but the norm. Where merchants were pirates, pirates were admirals, and the only law truly respected was the law of the strongest or the most cunning. This heritage endured long after the Middle Ages, shaping the naval and commercial practices of the following centuries and leaving an indelible mark on the maritime history of the Western world. The waves of the English Channel continue to break against the shores of England and France, just as they did centuries ago when these pirates sailed their waters. The ports that once sheltered privateers now welcome ferries and cargo ships. The estuaries where ambushes were prepared are now mapped by satellites, and the maritime routes that were once so dangerous are now the safest in the world. But somewhere, in the depths of these historical waters, echoes of that violent and fascinating past still resonate, reminding us of an era when the sea was truly the last lawless territory. If you have made it this far on this journey through the medieval seas of Northern Europe, it means you share our fascination with these forgotten stories that shaped the world we live in. Just as the navigators of that time depended on landmarks on the coast to find their way, we depend on viewers like you to continue exploring and sharing these extraordinary narratives. If this journey through time has sparked your curiosity and you wish to embark on more historical adventures with us, consider subscribing to the channel. Each subscription is like a favorable wind, pushing us to discover new chapters of human history. Leave your comment telling us which aspect of medieval piracy surprised you most, or which historical period you would like us to explore next. And if you know someone who would appreciate this journey through the seas of the past, share this documentary. After all, just as medieval merchants spread news from port to port, it is you who take our stories to new horizons. Until the next crossing through the oceans of history.